So what is the next candidate on trying to explain this 100 ppm change? So we went through the carbonate chemistry, and now we are back to putting that into this biological pump issue. So just in terms of basics, biological pump essentially is something I'll show in a minute, but you can also understand this in terms of the nutrient and oxygen profiles. What's happening essentially, you are having photosynthesis near the surface where there is enough light available. Obviously you need sunlight to combine CO2 and H2O with the chloroplasts and so on to create CH2O, sugar and carbohydrates. Photosynthesis uses up all the nutrients, not just CO2. You need also nitrate, iron, and many other micro and macronutrients. So you would imagine that if you look at the typical profile in the ocean, near the surface you would expect the nutrients like nitrate to be lower because photosynthesis is taking them up, and when photosynthesis happens, that eventually dies and sinks or is eaten by other zooplankton, phytoplankton, other small fish, big fish, and so on. It serves the food chain, supports the food chain, and that biomass falls down either as fecal matter or dead zooplankton, phytoplankton, dead fish, whatever, and that is remineralized and recycled. So you would expect the nitrate to then rebuild below the surface, right? The combination of circulation and biological pump is beautifully shown here. Because the Atlantic Ocean has a fast circulation because of this North Atlantic deep water formation, you can see that the water is getting refreshed by the sinking water from the surface, so the higher nutrients, higher production is falling down, but it is moving fast out of the system, whereas the Pacific Ocean, which has a general reconversion of the deeper nutrient rich waters converting to surface waters, there is no rapid circulation, so it builds up nutrients much more than in the Atlantic. So this is a combination of how the circulation works and how biology is riding on top of that in a vertical sense, and corresponding to that you would expect higher oxygen near the surface because of mixing with the atmosphere as well as the photosynthesis releasing oxygen. And as opposed to the nutrients, the story here would be that because higher oxygen water is sinking faster, you are actually increasing oxygen with depth. You can see all the way to the depth oxygen is higher in the Atlantic Ocean, whereas the Pacific water, which is older, is having this organic matter from the surface falling down, being consumed by various species that live below the surface, respiring that organic matter in various ways and using up the oxygen. Okay, so this is the so-called oxygen minimum zone, where you have the impact of direct consumption of the hydrocarbons and organic matter being respired and oxygen being consumed, and this is where the deeper water circulation of the sinking surface waters replenishing to some extent the deeper water oxygen. So the oxygen counterintuitively actually increases with depth here because of this thermohaline circulation. Okay, that's a quick story. Corresponding to that, you expect the CO2 to be lower near the surface because of photosynthesis being fixing the CO2 into organic matter. Pacific is older, so it's building up CO2, whereas the Atlantic gets ventilated because of this deep water formation, so it has lower CO2 sinking and lower CO2 all the way to the bottom. Obviously, if you do the pH, it's going to be flipped because it's going to be more acidic in the Pacific and less acidic in the Atlantic. Okay, with that background, The other thing we need to know is something called the Redfield ratio. In the 1940s, I think Redfield, who was a scientist, figured out that all the water samples he was getting and the nutrient ratios in phytoplankton were kind of occurring in a relatively fixed ratio, 106 to 16 to 1 when you looked at carbon, nitrogen and phosphorus. Obviously there is a question of how this happened over time. Phytoplankton took up nutrients in this ratio, and then they are getting remineralized, so they are re-releasing the nutrients into the water in that ratio. So over time the entire water column is mostly reached this kind of fixed carbon to nitrogen to phosphorus ratio, which helps us in various ways. For example, if you go in the Mediterranean Sea, the ratio is changing from place to place, then it's interesting to figure out how the Redfield ratio is being violated in some regions. Is it by the biology? Is it by the physics? Is it by deposition from somewhere else? And so on and so forth. With that brief background, let's spend a couple of minutes on this very complicated looking biological pump diagram from this Smithsonian Environmental Research Center in Edgewater, Maryland, in the US. Don't be intimidated. It's got a few simple things. You have CO2 obviously in the atmosphere going into the ocean and coming out of the ocean. So there is respiration and photosynthesis. Just like we need all the micro and macronutrients, the multivitamins that you take, photosynthesis in the ocean also needs iron and nitrogen. There is a nitrogen cycle that I'll show in a minute. There are nitrogen fixers in the ocean which can directly take dinitrogen or N2 and convert it into ammonium and nitrate for other phytoplankton which cannot directly use nitrate. So there are large phytoplankton which are eaten by zooplankton, small phytoplankton eaten by microzooplankton, and so on. And the organic matter that is formed, or the fecal pellets and detritus and so on, sink. So you have sinking particles and aggregate formations and so on. So you can see detritus here, etc. And there are zooplankton that migrate around, which I won't go into the detail, but any organic matter that's coming down is food. So that's going to be consumed by various species of bacteria and archaea and other fish and so on that are moving matter up and down as well. So they are being eaten by birds and human-sized fisheries and so on. So this movement of organic and carbon up and down in the water column is what we call the biological pump, as opposed to the mixing and the upwelling of the carbon by the circulation, which is called the solubility pump, which is what we mentioned before, which depends on pressure and temperature. So for example, CO2 increases with depth because temperatures are colder, pressure is higher with depth, so you can hold more CO2, which is why when calcium carbonate shells fall down, they're going to continue to dissolve in this acidic water. And we talked about calcium compensation depth and the saturation depth, where the rain rate of calcium carbonate is going to equal the dissolution rate, and if the particles manage to go below that, then dissolution rate is lower, so then they can sink to the bottom at a very small rate, but over time, thousands of years, they can accumulate and metamorphize into rocks, silicate rocks and limestone and so on and so forth. Okay, so the idea in the context of, not going to go into other details here, the idea in the context of CO2 changes in ice age versus non-ice age is that if somehow the biological pump got faster during the ice age, then maybe more CO2 would have been drawn down, right? The other idea is that biological pump probably did get accelerated because ice ages are drier, colder temperatures, less rain, more dust, and the dust that is lifted from soils and mountains and so on tend to contain the iron in it, minerals, which when deposited on the ocean can dissolve and feed the biological activities, because there are many places like the Eastern Pacific and the Southern Ocean where iron is a limiting nutrient. There is iron deficiency, which means even if nitrate is available, it's not being consumed because not enough iron is available. Okay, so this seems to work to some extent. Again, the question is, can it explain 80 to 100 ppm change? Turns out not so much, because you can look at other evidences. If biological pump was faster, you would expect more depleted carbon fixation, because photosynthesis takes up more C12 than C13, which would rain down and create lighter carbon at the bottom. Plus, this biological activity also drops organic carbon and increases oxygen consumption in the bottom, creating anoxic conditions. There are lots of other ideas about whether silica played a role, because diatoms, which use silica for forming shells, actually compete much better than other phytoplankton for nutrients when there is enough silica. So could they have bloomed more? And there is evidence that Southern Ocean does have more silica and there are more diatoms, but there is no evidence of that either. And you can also look at whether calcium carbonate deposition had gone up. That doesn't seem to work either, and so on and so forth. So put that also with a little bit more detail from the nitrogen cycle. For example, nitrogen is getting exchanged with the ocean. There is nitrogen fixation, which is going to create ammonium and nitrate for phytoplankton and living microbes which do photosynthesis. And then they decompose, and then particulate and dissolved organic nitrogen are going to drop. They're going to get remineralized into ammonium and nitrite and then nitrate. If there is in fact oxygen depletion or anoxic conditions, there are many bacteria, microbes which can split nitrate to get oxygen for themselves. That's called denitrification, which is going to release a nitrate back into nitrogen. So there is a loop that you can see here. So there is no evidence of anoxic conditions because of a stronger biological pump operating during the glacial times. There is no evidence of increased denitrification, I think, but you can check on that. So essentially, net, the story is that the idea of a stronger biological pump during the glacial times, which could explain 80 ppm drawdown, let alone 100 ppm drawdown, doesn't work. So that's another hypothesis that probably contributed some, but not completely, to explain 80 ppm change. Okay, so one more idea remains, which is the physical circulation change. Could circulation changes have happened which somehow created a blob of 500 gigaton of carbon to be buried somewhere in the ocean? We will see that next in the next podcast. Okay, so it's kind of running through the explanations, but I hope you can listen again and make sure that you understood that the dissolution hypothesis of colder ocean waters taking up more CO2 or the biological pump drawing down more CO2 don't explain the range of CO2 change needed for the glacial deglacial changes. Okay.